Sawadee-ka, hello and welcome to Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha. Today is our Pali Canon and English study group where we study the words of the Buddha. We're in volume 12, which is titled The Lowly Arts. We're going to be studying chapters 31 through 40 this week, helping you guys to be able to understand the path to enlightenment as the Buddha taught through his own words. The way that we do this program is a bit different than I do other programs, where other programs I teach in a more traditional method, where I'm teaching for 15, 20, 30 minutes and opening up for questions, teaching another 15, 20, 30 minutes and opening up for questions. In this program, what I do is I invite students who are in Zoom to be able to volunteer to read a chapter from our book. And then after someone reads the chapter, I will then share some teachings on that and then open up for any questions that you guys might have. If you're in Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, you can ask questions by putting that into the comment section, or you can raise your hand in Zoom electronically and unmute your microphone and ask any and all questions that you like that way. And if you're in Zoom, you can also electronically raise your hand in order to volunteer to read. And then, like I mentioned, after someone reads, I'll share some teachings on that and then open up to whatever questions that you guys have. So we're going to be studying chapters 31 through 40 today. And it looks like Vibhav volunteered to read. So go ahead, sir.
Chapter 31. Those who caused the good teachings to disappear. Second discourse. Monks. Those monks who explain the meaning and the teachings by means of badly acquired discourses, whose phrasing is an approximation of the correct phrasing, are acting for the harm of many people, for the unhappiness of many people, for the ruin, harm, and suffering of many people, of heavenly beings and human beings. These monks generate much unwholesome karma, and cause the good teachings to disappear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vibhav. So this is kind of a shorter discourse of something we studied last week, where the Buddha is helping people to be able to see that by essentially changing his teachings and not having very accurate phrasing as you're sharing his teachings, it's going to cause harm to you and to countless other people. Because in order for the teachings of the Buddha to be able to be effective, they need to be shared in the way that he actually shared them. Whereas if we change the teachings of a Buddha, they're not going to be effective. Essentially, a Buddha has figured out how to get to enlightenment by themselves without the help of any teachers or any guides. Then they dedicate the rest of their life to sharing those independently discovered teachings with countless people. And countless people are going to get to enlightenment during their lifetime. What they're doing is they're putting down lights along the path to enlightenment, illuminating it, making it bright for everybody to be able to see what it takes to be able to get to enlightenment. And then they're going to preserve their teachings in such a way that countless more people will get to enlightenment after their death. So those lights that they've laid down along the path, the way that that continues in the world is through the hearts and the minds of countless people, that they then share those teachings in the same way that the Buddha shared them. But if we don't share the teachings in the way that the Buddha shared them, if we either overtly change them or we inadvertently change them, then that's like knocking over the lights. And eventually, if you're out there in the dark and all the lights have been knocked over, you don't know where the path is, right? So it's very important to maintain the teachings of a Buddha in the way that he actually taught them. Otherwise, it's going to cause harm for countless beings, for yourself and others. He's talking here about heavenly beings and human beings, that is causing harm to these beings. That's because those are the ones that can actually get to enlightenment. The beings in the hell realm, animal realm, and afflicted spirit realm that can't actually get to enlightenment. So it's these heavenly beings and human beings that are actually going to be harmed by changing the teachings. And then eventually, once those beings in the lower realms get into the heavenly and human realm, it's causing harm to them too, right? And oftentimes we think about these realms as being a really far distant place, but they're all in the same time and space as us. So these heavenly beings are right here, able to hear these teachings if they choose to learn and practice the teachings. So it would cause harm to these types of beings because they're actually able to get to enlightenment, but they're not hearing the true teachings in the heavenly realm or the human realm. And it's producing much unwholesome karma, that this is going to cause his teachings to disappear. And the Buddha actually predicted this during his lifetime, that there would be this gradual declining of his teachings over a 2,500 year period. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this discourse. You can put those into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. So it looks like Samantha has a question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Teacher David. Just a quick quick answer to your previous comment. I would still like some help with that. And yes, I had to make a new profile.
Okay.
For this chapter, just in general, you've been very kind and gone back to the original teachings and written them in such a way that we understand them now versus, the Pali Canon and maybe some of the wording and phrasing. Say 500 years from now, another teacher comes along and sees that, maybe perhaps even your interpretation of the Pali Canon isn't as easy for people 500 years from now to understand. Would that teacher be best going back to the original Pali Canon to, I guess, kind of rephrase or reword it for future people? Or would they be able to do it based off your teachings?
Okay, so first,
your interpretation.
Yeah. So first, if you'd like to stick around after class, Samantha, we can talk about what you had asked questions about a few classes ago.
Okay.
If there's teachers 500 years from now that are having challenges to understand what's being shared here, which I don't anticipate they will, but if they did, they would be wise to just update the word choices that I'm sharing here. Because as we know, like Old English from many hundreds of years ago, it's kind of challenging for us to understand it today. But I think we've gotten to a level of modern English that this is going to transcend time. I suspect that the English that we speak today, while there may be new words that are added, that these words and the phrasing that we're using here should transcend time and should last till the end of time, because we're not going to see significant changes to the English language from this point forward. And one of the things that is going to be in place by the time that I die is my son will be teaching. He's been holding to that. He made that decision when he was 7 or 8 years old, and he's actually making decisions on his own to head in that direction. And there'll be other teachers too, besides my son, that'll be teaching, and they will then teach other students. And these teachings will be around for a long time, where like during the lifetime of the Buddha, he didn't have the ability to sit down and write out a Word document with a word processor and explain exactly what it took for him to get to enlightenment. He didn't have YouTube videos and podcasts and all these other things. So these things are more, obviously they're not permanent, but they're a more stable way of documenting the teachings than we've had at any other time in human history. So these teachings that I'm sharing and the efforts that I'm putting in and that you guys are supporting me to be able to do is to lay down for now and all of time for people to be able to now know what the teachings are, and they've been captured in a very stable way through YouTube, through podcasts, through books and documents and files, and they're backed up in multiple backups and stuff like that. So I suspect these will transcend time, but there could be little words here or there that need to be modified. But also I'd like to add that what I'm sharing here, I don't look at them as interpretations, even though I understand some people might think of it that way, because ultimately what you're trying to get to as a teacher communicating teachings to a student is trying to help them to be able to see the natural laws. And these natural laws are here and active and readily able to be seen by those people who understand where to look for it. And what a teacher is doing is explaining to you where to look and what those natural laws are, so that then a student can then look at them and independently verify them for themselves. So if there's an interpretation, it means that there's something that's unclear and it needs to be interpreted in a way for someone to understand it today. Where when I read the teachings of the Buddha, they're very clear to me. I understand them. And all I'm doing is providing clear translations that make it easy for people to understand. But those understandings, they're not going to change because they're pointing to the natural laws that can be independently verified. So for example, there's not going to be a teacher 500 years from now that's like, oh, it's not craving, desire, attachment that leads to discontentedness. It's this thing over here. David interpreted it wrong. So it's not going to be that kind of thing, because these teachings that I'm sharing and the words that I'm using to explain them, they can be independently verified through your own direct experience. So there shouldn't be a need to modify any of the words unless there's like, I don't know, I can't see any words in this discourse because it's kind of short, but if there was some word that, people started using in a different way, they might change this word acquired to something else or something like that. But the underlying meaning and the wording and what that's pointing to in terms of the natural law to be able to independently verify would be the same. So perhaps that helps you.
Okay, thank you. I should have used the word translation instead of interpretation. I didn't mean to suggest you had interpreted anything. Translation was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I can see, from Old English till now, but, who knows? There's obviously going to be change in the world. The English language will slightly change as we go forward in life, but I can't see it changing significantly beyond what we've got here, because it seems that we've got a very clear, easy way to understand this language and communicate with each other. But who knows, what may or may not occur. And then there's going to be someone like my son. And then, perhaps there's other family members beyond him that are choosing to teach, as well as teachers that aren't necessarily related to me, that will ensure that people know that it's unwise to change the teachings of Buddha. Okay, so it looks like Vibhav has a question. Go ahead, sir.
Just a question on Buddha predicted that there'll be another Buddha rising, Maitri Buddha, around this time frame. Is there a prediction of any more Buddhas coming? Because humanity is going to be around, say, for about 80,000 years. And like I said, the difference between the first Buddha and the predicted Buddha is 2,500 years. So there's still what, 70,000 years or 78,000 years of humanity still to go. So is there any prediction of any more Buddhas coming in the future?
There is no other prediction. If Maitreya Buddha does the work that he needs to do, and the people around Maitreya Buddha does the work that they need to do, there won't be a need for another Buddha, because the teachings will be in such a condition that they can last for the end of humanity, which is predicted to be about 80,000 years. So there won't be a need for another Buddha after that, and there won't be another Buddha after that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see what other questions we have here. So Janae is asking, so heavenly beings learn from humans? Yeah, they can learn from the teachings of the Buddha being spoken by a human being. That's how they actually learn. Okay, let me just see if we have anything in Facebook. Like my internet's a little bit slow today. Okay, I don't see any other questions. This next chapter is very similar to the previous one. We can read it if you guys like, but it's just the opposite of what we just read. Was there someone who would like to read this? Okay, Samantha, go ahead, ma'am.
Those who sustain the good teachings. Second discourse. Monks, those monks who explain the meaning and the teachings with well-acquired discourses, whose phrasing is not mere approximation, are acting for the welfare of many people, for the peacefulness of many people, for the good, welfare, and peacefulness of many people, of heavenly beings and human beings. These monks generate much merit and sustain the good teachings. Okay, thank you, ma'am. So here the Buddha is explaining how important it is to have these accurate words and phrasings, that they're not just mere approximations, that you're really paying attention to each individual word and phrase that you're using when you're sharing his teachings. Whether you're sharing them as a teacher, of course, you're going to pay a lot of attention to how you're describing the teachings there. But even if somebody asks you at a bus stop, what did the Buddha teach about this? It's really wise to use accurate words and phrases as you have learned them, because an individual who's learned through a certain collection of teachings and they see that those teachings have led to improvement to their mind and their life, you wouldn't be interested in changing those. And if you don't have ego,
you wouldn't also be interested in changing what those teachings are, because if they led to your enlightenment or close to enlightenment, then you would like to maintain them in that same condition so that other people can experience that enlightened mental state as well. It's kind of like if you created a recipe and you were the inventor of chocolate, right? You would like to be able to replicate this recipe so more and more people could actually make chocolate. Now, this isn't necessarily the best analogy because obviously we tweak recipes in order to be able to have it flavored in one way or the other. But at least you understand what I'm sharing, that if you tasted this amazing food like chocolate and you're like, oh my goodness, I would like other people to experience this, you would like to replicate this recipe so that many people can experience it. And it's the same thing with enlightenment, that if there's a certain collection of teachings that are leading to the improvement of your mind and your life, and you're seeing your mind getting closer and closer to enlightenment, then you wouldn't be interested in changing those teachings. And if there's no ego there, then there's no reason to change them. You know, the Buddha did the hard work to be able to get to enlightenment by himself without the help of any teachers or any guides. We don't have to go out and reinvent the wheel. All we need to do is learn and practice what he taught, and that's what's going to lead to enlightenment. And that's one of the ways to practice loving kindness and compassion, right? This genuine interest in seeing all beings be well and the concern for the misfortune of others is to practice loving kindness and compassion, is to be able to share the teachings in the same way as the Buddha. Whereas if we actually modified his teachings, this would be ill will towards all these countless beings that aren't going to be able to get to enlightenment. And that's why the Buddha said in the previous discourse that it causes harm to countless people. But here, by maintaining the words and phrases that are accurate, that aren't mere approximation, that's acting for the welfare of many people, the peacefulness of many people, because now these teachings can propagate in the world in such a way that countless people will get to enlightenment. And this is the way to produce much wholesome Dhamma that will see the world just continually becoming more and more harmonious, that we'll see more and more improvement in the world as countless beings learn these teachings. So let me know if you guys have any questions here. Okay, I don't see any questions. Would someone like to read chapter 33? Okay, got Vibhav and Samantha, so we'll just kind of rotate. I guess Vibhav first and then Samantha.
10 roots of disputes. Venerable Sir, why is it that arguments, conflict, contention, and disputes arise in the community and monks do not reside at ease? Here, Pali. 1. Monks explain non-teachings as teachings. 2. And teachings as non-teachings. 3. They explain non-discipline as discipline. And 4. Discipline as non-discipline. 5. They explain what has not been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as having been stated and spoken by him. And 6. What has been stated and spoken by the Tathagata was not having been stated and spoken by him. 7. They explain what has not been practiced by the Tathagata as having been practiced by him. And 8. What has been practiced by the Tathagata as not having been practiced by him. 9. They explain what has not been prescribed by the Tathagata as having been prescribed by him. And 10. What has been prescribed by the Tathagata as not having been prescribed by him. This, O Pali, is why arguments, conflict, contention, and disputes arise in the community of monks, and monks do not reside at ease. Venerable Sir, how many roots of disputes are there? There are, Pali, 10 roots of disputes. What 10? Here. 1. Monks explain non-teachings as teachings. 2. And teachings as non-teachings. 3. They explain non-discipline as discipline. And 4. Discipline as non-discipline. 5. They explain what has not been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as having been stated and spoken by him. And 6. What has been stated and spoken by the Tathagata as not having been stated and spoken by him. 7. They explain what has been practiced by the Tathagata as having been practiced by him. And 8. What has been practiced by the Tathagata as not having been practiced by him. 9, they explain that as what has not been prescribed by the Tathagata as having been prescribed by him. And 10, what has been prescribed by the Tathagata as not having been prescribed by him. These, Upali, are the 10 roots of disputes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So obviously, the thing that causes arguments, conflict, contentions, and disputes, this is what's going on in the mind. This is the craving, the anger, the ignorance, the pollutions, the 10 fetters. But in terms of the topics that a community of ordained practitioners could potentially have argument and conflict about, that's what it is here, right? If anybody's arguing or having conflicts or contention or disputes, it comes back to the pollutions of the mind. That's the ultimate root. But in terms of the topics that a community might actually have disagreement on and disputes about, that's what the Buddha is talking about here. So these are the 10 topics that might produce argumentative discussion within a community of ordained practitioners or even students, any community that's learning and practicing the teachings. You know, you might think about ordained practitioners as everybody sitting around meditating, they're just kind of all in their best behavior. This isn't necessarily true. You know, like in ordained communities, they'll argue, they'll be upset and have conflicts if they're unenlightened, right? If they're enlightened, they're not going to be arguing and having disputes. Even when somebody disagrees with what it is that they understand as teachings, they're not going to argue with that person. They're not going to try to convince that person that what they understand is true and accurate. Because an enlightened being, they'll just walk down the street with a smile, right? They'll just walk down the street with wisdom and a smile. They're not out there trying to adamantly convince people, passionately trying to convince people of what it is that they know about the teachings. If someone asks a question, they will share that with them, but they're not going to be out there beating a drum and trying to convince other people of what the teachings are, because they know what the teachings are. Their mind's completely peaceful and joyful. It's led to their enlightenment. And if other people would like to know what that is, then they'll share it with them. But they're not going to argue. They're not going to have conflict, contention, or disputes about these things. So if somebody explained non-teachings as teachings and teachings as non-teachings, in a group of people who aren't enlightened, but they understand the teachings to a certain degree, they'll argue, they'll fight, and they'll fester. And if you've spent any time on Facebook or any of the other social media platforms where people are having discussions about Buddhism, if you go into like Buddhist groups, you're going to see lots of arguments, lots of people, having conflict and contention and disputes with each other, trying to argue about what the teachings are and what they're not. And oftentimes these people aren't even studying with the original words of the Buddha. They're just, arguing about the things that somebody told them or that they think is potentially the teachings of the Buddha. So here again, this is just another way of helping you to be able to see that it's really unwise to change the teachings of the Buddha. But what I add to this is that it's unwise to argue or have fights about anything, including the teachings of the Buddha, because an enlightened being isn't arguing. They're not fighting with people. They're not going out in the world and trying to convince people of something. They just peacefully go about their business. And if people would like to know the truth, okay, they'll share it with them. If they're not interested in knowing the truth, they would like to argue and fight and fester, okay, just walk away, right? There's no reason to sit there and try to convince this person of anything because they haven't chosen to actually learn. So if somebody was trying to convince another person of something, this is the mind's craving, trying to convince that person of something. So you'd like to get rid of all of that. And if you know what the teachings are, be appreciative and have gratitude for that. But don't feel like you have to go out into the world and convince other people of that. And you certainly wouldn't be interested in arguing with anybody. You can just walk down the street with wisdom and a smile. Let me know what questions you guys have here. Looks like Samantha has a question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Just a quickie on number maybe 9 and 10. The word prescribed, what does that mean? I understand practiced, but what is the difference between that and prescribed?
Yeah, prescribed is like him guiding you to practice in a certain way. The guidance that he's giving you.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Let me see if we have anything on Facebook or YouTube. And it looks like Vibhav has a question. Go ahead, sir.
I was wondering if the discourse has been kind of repeated from the first 10, the second 10 seems to be similar, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, sometimes the Buddha will repeat like this intentionally just to kind of help the mind to be able to soak it in. So here, this first one is, why is it that that they argue, have conflicts, contention, disputes arise in the community of monks? And then down here is just how many roots of disputes are there? So it's two separate questions with the same answer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now we can move on to the next chapter. Is there someone who would like to read this one? Chapter 34. Okay, Samantha, go ahead, ma'am.
Disciples who behave towards the teacher with hostility and with friendliness. And how do disciples behave towards the teacher with hostility, not with friendliness? Here, Ananda, compassionate and seeking their welfare, the teacher teaches the teachings to the disciples out of compassion. This is for your welfare. This is for your peacefulness. His disciples do not want to hear or give ear or apply effort with their minds to understand. They stray and turn away from the teacher's teachings. Thus do disciples behave towards the teacher with hostility, not with friendliness. And how do disciples behave towards the teacher with friendliness, not with hostility? Here, Ananda, compassionate and seeking their welfare, the teacher teaches the teachings to the disciples out of compassion. This is for your welfare. This is for your peacefulness. His disciples are interested to hear and give ear and apply effort with their minds to understand. They do not stray and turn away from the teacher's teachings. Thus do disciples behave towards their teacher with friendliness, not with hostility. Therefore, Ananda, behave towards me with friendliness, not with hostility. That will lead to your welfare and peacefulness for a long time. I shall not treat you as the potter treats the raw, damp clay, repeatedly restraining you. I shall speak to you, Ananda. Repeatedly guiding you of what to avoid, I shall speak to you, Ananda. The truly dedicated will stand the test.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. So a teacher who's sharing the teachings with their students is doing so out of compassion, which is concern for their misfortune. Because anybody who's choosing to be a teacher, they will either be enlightened or close to it, and they're able to then help others to be able to understand that path. And they have this concern for the misfortune of others, because knowing what this enlightened mental state is and how peaceful and joyful it is, but then seeing other people suffer and having struggles and difficulties in life, that individual with their compassion is interested in sharing the teachings with others. And not everybody who gets to enlightenment is going to be a teacher, but those who aspire to be a teacher, they would be teaching out of compassion if they're doing it in the way that the Buddha taught. And part of teaching out of compassion is to not charge a student for actually learning with you, not to have expectations or wanting or desiring anything from your students. Instead, just doing it out of the kindness of your heart, essentially. So if a teacher is set up in that way, where they're just sharing out of the kindness of their heart, and they're putting forth the effort out of this interest in seeing their students have this peacefulness and this improved welfare, and a student was to, turn away and be like, I don't want to hear that, it's basically, straying away from the teacher, where they're not interested in learning those teachings, then that person isn't really a student yet. They haven't decided that these are teachings that they would like to learn. Of course, they still have doubt in their mind about this teacher and the teachings that are being shared, because they're kind of disgruntled and pushing the teachings away. And also there's cravings and ego in there, right? There's conceit that's in the mind that's producing this as well. So the Buddha is describing this as hostility towards the teacher. And it's actually hurting yourself, right? It's not hurting the teacher. The Buddha's teachings are all about how to guide you in getting to enlightenment. And one of the things that a teacher sometimes needs to do is teach a student how to be a student. That's what the Buddha is doing here, is teaching students how to be a student so that you can get the most benefit out of the path. For a teacher who's enlightened or very close to enlightenment, if a student chooses to turn away from their teachings, that teacher isn't hurt by that. They're not experiencing any painful feelings. They're only teaching out of compassion for that concern for the misfortune of their students and looking to improve their welfare and their peacefulness. They're aspiring to see their students to grow and develop on the path, but whether the student actually does that or not is a choice for them to make. So there's this hostility that the Buddha is describing from a student to a teacher But again, it's to the harm of the student. It's not to the harm of the teacher. So the Buddha is giving you guidance here of how to be a good student, because that's sometimes what a teacher needs to teach, is how to be a good student. There's some cultures that are very disrespectful towards teachers. And for those people whose minds have been conditioned that way and growing up that way, they would have difficulties to learn this path from a teacher. They would need to first learn how to actually be a student in order to be able to get the benefit of learning and growing on the path. So that's what the Buddha is sharing down here, is that it would be wise to learn the teachings, and it would be wise to not stray away from the teachings and give ear and apply your effort to understand the teachings. Giving ear is to actively listen and learn and understand the teachings. Because again, a teacher isn't doing anything for themselves. They're not sharing the teachings because they want something or expect something from their students. It's not because of what they want. They're just sharing the teachings in order to help anybody who's interested in learning and practicing the teachings. So it's for the benefit of the students. So for the student to choose to learn and practice, it's for their benefit that they're actually experiencing that. It's not for the benefit of the teacher. So this is acting in friendliness and not with hostility towards the teacher. And the Buddha is encouraging his student Ananda to function with this friendliness and not with hostility. One of the other teachings the Buddha gives on the same type of topic that I think is very helpful, and the imagery is very good to help you remember this, is he talks about residing as a newly arrived bride, right? If a newly arrived bride or a newly arrived groom moved in with their in-laws, at the beginning of that, they would probably be on their best behavior, right? Because they're new to the home, they're not interested to cause any waves, and maybe for the first 30 days or so, they're on their best behavior. But then for a person who's not a newly arrived bride, what they may end up doing is they may end up kind of being disgruntled and irritated and angry towards their in-laws and their brothers and sisters, their sister-in-laws and brothers-in-laws. They might push them away, be like, what do you know? Where at the beginning of their stay, they were so kind and polite and warm and gentle. But then as time went on and they got comfortable being around these people, they started to become irritable and grumpy and hostile towards their in-laws and their sister-in-laws and brother-in-laws. Or what the Buddha encourages you to do is to always reside as a newly arrived bride towards your teacher. Because remember, that person isn't motivated by money or wanting or expecting anything from you. They're just there to help you, and that's it. So having hostility or bitterness towards a teacher is only going to produce harm for yourself. It's going to produce unwholesome karma for yourself, because you're not going to be able to get the teachings that you need in order to be able to learn and grow and develop on the path. So the Buddha is encouraging Ananda here to reside with friendliness, not with hostility. And you can see in other teachings where he teaches students to reside as a newly arrived bride. And that's the way you would like to have that relationship with a teacher all the way through your entire journey to enlightenment. Part of getting to enlightenment is to learn how to have harmonious relationships with all people around you. There's probably, and as you first get onto the path, there's certain people around you that you have difficulties having relationships with. And you can see that you have difficulties in those relationships. You haven't figured out how to have harmonious relationships there. And because an unenlightened being doesn't know how to have harmonious relationships, maybe with their parents or their life partner, their siblings, their children, and stuff like this, they will sometimes even have difficulties having a relationship with their teacher too. And they need to be able to see that problem within their mind and then improve that so that they can learn how to have harmonious relationships. Because if you can't have a harmonious relationship with an enlightened being, you can't have a harmonious relationship with anybody. Because an enlightened being is not going to be causing any harm whatsoever in the way that they interact with you through their intention, speech, and actions. And of course, as you guys know, your mind is causing your own discontentedness. But if someone can't have a harmonious relationship with an enlightened being, they can't have a harmonious relationship with just about anybody. So by having that teacher to be able to help you to learn how to have a harmonious relationship with them, now you can replicate that in other parts of your life, and it'll help you to get to enlightenment where you can have harmony in all your relationships. And the way that the Buddha does this is kind of summed up in this last paragraph, where he says, I shall not treat you as the potter treats the raw, damp clay, repeatedly restraining you. Because that's what you would need to do if there was raw, damp clay. You'd have to, repeatedly restrain this clay because it can't hold its own shape. Instead, the Buddha says, I shall speak to you, right? He's going to speak to his student, Ananda. And what he's going to do is he's going to repeatedly guide him of what to avoid, meaning helping him understand the wisdom of these natural laws and what to avoid in day-to-day life. He shall speak to his student, right? So once a teacher is teaching their student and speaking to them, it's not their role to restrain their student. It's up to the student to learn the wisdom of what's wise and unwise, and then learn how to restrain themselves. It's not up to the teacher to restrain that student. And that's what the Buddha is explaining here. So he didn't go around, restraining his students from getting into difficulties and trouble. It's kind of like this. When I first had my son, he was very young. He started crawling around and walking around. There was a period of time where I was home with him, and he kept walking towards the stove. We were living in the USA at the time. And I kept restraining him and pulling him back because I knew the stove was hot and he was going to touch it and he was going to get burned. But then eventually I was like, you know what? I'm just going to let him get close to the stove. I'm going to sit here and watch him and let him learn the wisdom that when you touch this device, it's going to hurt. And then he can gain that wisdom. So even though initially I was restraining him like 2, 3, 4 times, eventually I just let him go. And he got close to the stove and he went to touch it and he could feel the heat and he pulled his hand back. And he never touched the stove or attempted to touch the stove after that because he had the wisdom that he needed, right? As parents, as a teacher, if we constantly restrained our students, they would never get the ability within their mind to restrain it themselves. They wouldn't have the wisdom nor the ability to restrain their mind. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is not be attached to this being and understanding that they're going to sometimes need to experience struggles and difficulties in order to be able to cultivate the wisdom and gain the ability to restrain their own mind. And then ultimately, the Buddha says the truly dedicated will stand the test. Because getting to enlightenment, as you guys know, isn't 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. It's going to be a multiple year journey. So in order to be able to transcend all those pollutions and get those all out of the mind, you're going to need to be dedicated to hear guidance from a teacher, which can sometimes be impactful to the ego. The ego doesn't like to hear the things that you're doing unwise. Maybe the mind wants to appear to be perfect in front of the teacher, or maybe the ego just doesn't like hearing that it's done things that are unwise. So to be able to go through multiple year journey of hearing things that you're doing that is unwise and then be dedicated enough to improve it, that's where you're going to actually be able to get to enlightenment. So the truly dedicated will stand the test and be able to overcome the pollutions and actually get to enlightenment. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter. You can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or in Zoom. Okay, Mayuli's asking a question. She says, teacher, if one of the disputes causes separation in the community, is that considered as one of the grave acts? Yes. If somebody is doing something intentionally to split the community and their actions, whether it was verbal or mental or bodily actions, split the community, that's one of those grave acts that the Buddha talked about in some of the previous discourses that we studied. Okay, I don't see any other questions anywhere. So chapter 35, is there someone who would like to read this? Okay, we'll go with Keely since she hasn't read yet. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. A difference between the perfectly enlightened one and the monk liberated by wisdom. The Tathagata monks, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, is the originator of the path arisen before, the producer of the path unproduced before, the declarer of the path undeclared before. He is the knower of the path, the discoverer of the path, the one skilled in the path, and his disciple now reside practicing that path and become possessed of it afterwards. This monk is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between the Tathagata, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one, and the monk liberated by wisdom. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. All right, so here the Buddha is talking about the difference between a Buddha, which is the Tathagata, and an individual who gets to enlightenment based on the teachings of a Tathagata. That these are two different things. If you guys have seen the 5 rare treasures that the Buddha talks about, where he talks about how rare it is that a Tathagata exists in the world, you understand that it's not very common for there to be a Buddha in the world. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world that think that everybody is a Buddha, or that everybody has Buddha nature. And this isn't actually true. Everybody has the ability to get to enlightenment, but they wouldn't actually be a Buddha at that point. So the Buddha here is helping to be able to see this distinction and difference between a Buddha and an individual who gets to enlightenment based on the teachings of a Buddha. A Buddha, which is also an Arahant, because remember, an Arahant is an enlightened being. An Arahant is someone who's eliminated the 10 fetters. So every enlightened being is an Arahant. But not everyone is a perfectly enlightened one, because a perfectly enlightened one is an actual Buddha who's gotten to enlightenment by themselves, and they don't have all this extra baggage around like an average enlightened being may have 5%, 10%, 20%. If you've learned from someone who's not a Buddha, you might have gotten to enlightenment, but you still have a little bit of extra baggage around of things that didn't actually contribute to your enlightenment. So an individual who's a Buddha doesn't have that. By the time they get to enlightenment, what they know is exactly the path to enlightenment. They're perfectly enlightened. And they will be the originator of the path. At least Gotama Buddha was the originator of the path, unarisen before, right? So this is where you'll see this conflict, where sometimes in the Pali Canon, you'll see documentation of the Buddha having talked about previous Buddhas. But here you see him talking about that his path, that he was the originator of it, and it was unarisen before him, meaning it didn't exist before him. The producer of the path, unproduced before him. Again, that there was no one else that knew it before. And then the declarer of the path, undeclared before him, right? Essentially is what he's sharing here. So a Tathagata is the knower of the path, the discoverer of the path, the one skilled in the path, right? So he figured out how to get to enlightenment by himself. That's what the uniqueness of an individual who's going to become a Buddha. And then, of course, they're going to dedicate the rest of their life to sharing their independently discovered teachings, and countless people will get to enlightenment during that person's lifetime, and they will preserve their teachings in such a way that countless more people will get to enlightenment after their death. Well, an individual who has gotten to enlightenment, which here is being described as the disciples of the Buddha, they are dedicated to this path, right? Here, the word possessed is being used, right? Where we probably don't think about it quite that way, where it's the Buddha would tend to talk in extremes because that helps people to understand it. But what he's basically talking about is he discovered the path, and then he shares that path, and now his students are now practicing that path, and they're becoming dedicated to that path, right? Where they're not the ones who discovered it. The students weren't the ones who discovered it. So this is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between a Buddha, a perfectly enlightened one, and a monk who's liberated by wisdom. Because a Buddha figured out that wisdom by themselves, but an individual who's an Arahant, who's learned from a Buddha or from the teachings of a Buddha, they would have needed to cultivate that wisdom through learning the teachings of a Buddha in order to be able to get to that enlightened mental state. So let me know what questions you guys have here. Looks like Samantha has a question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Teacher David. If the Tathagata was the first person to practice the path and find the path, does that mean that no one before him had ever been enlightened? Because no one else would have had the path?
That's the way that I tend to think about this. But, other people have other perspectives, because I can see things like in Hindu teachings, for example, that are very similar to what the Buddha taught. And I've even, observed people that are deeply into Hinduism that appear on the surface to be enlightened potentially. But of course, I'm not with that person day in and day out, so I don't know. I've even talked with Christians who on the surface, they look actually pretty enlightened, the way that they interact and the way they function. But I don't know, because I'm not with them day in and day out. So I tend to think about it as the Buddha was the first person who figured out how to get to enlightenment, and anybody else after that would have learned some variation of his teachings. But the thing too is that these natural laws are natural laws, and different people can tap into them at different times. And this is one of the reasons why we see so many similarities between things like Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Muslim teachings, and things like this. So if somebody taps into these teachings in a certain way, they might not have described them in the same way as the Buddha, but they could have gotten to some degree of awakening, or we might even call it enlightenment, but we would need to be with that person to be able to know for sure. But we don't have any documented proof of any enlightened beings existing before the Buddha, so we don't have that. And then we do have in the Pali Canon where the Buddha says that it would be impossible for someone to even get to the first stage of enlightenment without the Eightfold Path, let alone enlightenment itself. So he's saying that if there's a collection of teachings that doesn't include the Eightfold Path, then the person wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment. And one of the ways that you can see this truth for yourself is that with the 4 foundations of mindfulness in that 7th factor, where you learn to understand the bodily sensations that are arising as part of discontentedness, getting ready to arise, then there's the feeling, right? Then there's the condition of the mind, and then there's the mental object that is fed and reinforced and more deeply rooted. Well, once you see the bodily sensations arising, you're taught with right effort to cut that off and let that go. Because if you keep allowing the mind to experience the feeling, the mind stays wired that way. So if someone keeps looking at their feelings, observing their feelings, indulging in their feelings, they're never going to get to enlightenment this way because the mind continues to stay wired that way. So what you need to be able to do is get ahead of the curve, which is cut off and let go at the bodily sensations. And if you're able to do that every single time, you're about 1 to 3 years away from enlightenment. And it'll take you multiple years to even get to this point where you can cut off and let go every single time at the bodily sensations. But having done so, now you're ahead of the curve. The mind's no longer forming conditioned feelings. So the mind's being transformed to no longer form those conditioned feelings. And you're actually really close to enlightenment at that point. So I don't know of any other teachings, and I haven't studied everything in the world. So that's why I say I don't know of any. I haven't studied everything, but I don't know of any other teachings that teach this type of thing, because there really is no secret to the path to enlightenment. But if there was a secret, or if there's one linchpin, if there's one thing that you could look at and be like, that's transformational. Without that particular thing, you wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment. It's this, what I just described, is understanding the 4 foundations of mindfulness and applying right effort at the bodily sensations. But we could also say, if you didn't understand breathing mindfulness meditation, you couldn't get to enlightenment. If you didn't understand loving kindness meditation, you wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment. If you didn't understand right speech, you wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment. But in terms of like allowing all these other things to come into practice, like something like right speech, you wouldn't be able to practice right speech without right mindfulness and right effort. So I can see what the Buddha is saying very clearly, that without the Eightfold Path, you wouldn't be able to get to the first stage of enlightenment, let alone enlightenment itself. So I don't know of any other teachings that teach this kind of methodology and bringing your awareness to understanding that the actual goal in this life is to eliminate these discontent feelings. And here's exactly how to do that. I don't know of any other teachings like that. So I tend to think that the Buddha was the first enlightened being, but I don't have insight into everybody that existed prior to him, or what other teachings may or may not have been around prior to him. Okay, it looks like Vibhav has a question. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, David. Along the same lines, the question, I guess, and the way you're explaining it also in the teachings, it does say that once you get to the first stage, you have to have confidence in the teachings and the Buddha and the community and everything. And so it seems, and I guess the knowing of the whole Eightfold Path itself, which is not, from my understanding, is not very or fully prescribed in the teaching that I've been exposed to in Hinduism. So it just seemed unlikely or rare that somebody would get to enlightenment, or is it possible that they're in some, like they're experiencing some jhanas or some form of mental, I guess, awareness or purity that they prescribe it to enlightenment?
Yeah, I can see how these other collection of teachings, even though I don't know them inside and out, like someone who's into Hinduism or, some of these other teachings, I can see just on the surface how they could easily produce things like the jhanas. I could easily see that. In that, when someone's in the jhanas, if you weren't around them every moment of their day, looking back from afar, they can appear to be enlightened. In fact, many people who are in the jhanas actually think that they're enlightened themselves, but they're not. So you would need to actually be around that person day in and day out to be able to see how their mind functions, to be able to know whether they're enlightened, or you would need to be able to ask them questions to be able to see if they're actually enlightened or not. But again, you guys have probably heard me say this in the past, where our goal isn't to go around and determine who is enlightened or who isn't enlightened. So this is just kind of a discussion about the question that Samantha brought up is, were there enlightened beings before the Buddha? There could have been, but I don't know that that's true. But I don't see how there could have been, because the Eightfold Path didn't exist prior to the Buddha. So I tend to think of it as the Buddha was the first enlightened being. And then, of course, we had plenty after that. This is an interesting topic to talk about and interesting to consider, but it doesn't change anything about each individual person's enlightenment. Like Vibhav, you still need to get to enlightenment. Samantha, each individual person still needs to get to enlightenment. So while these things are oftentimes interesting to talk about, it doesn't change the fact that you still need to do the work to get to enlightenment. And we know what those teachings are and focus on those.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me see if we have anything anywhere else. I don't see anything anywhere else. So let's go to the next one. This is chapter 36. Is there someone who would like to read this? Okay, it looks like Leo. Go ahead, sir. And then Samantha raised her hand as well.
The Tathagata taught very few compared to the numerous things he had known. On one occasion, the perfectly enlightened one was residing at Kosambi in a Simsapa grove. Then the perfectly enlightened one took up a few Simsapa leaves in his hand and addressed the monks thus: "What do you think, monks? Which is more numerous? These few Simsapa leaves that I have taken up in my hand, or those in the Simsapa grove overhead? Venerable Sir, the Simsapa leaves that the perfectly enlightened one has taken up in his hand are few, but those in the Simsapa grove overhead are numerous. So too, monks, the things I have directly known but have not taught you are numerous, while the things I have taught you are few. And why, monks, have I not taught those many things? Because they are unbeneficial, irrelevant to the fundamentals of the holy life, and do not lead to fading away of strong feelings, to freedom from strong feelings, elimination, to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Therefore I have not taught them. And what, monks, have I taught? I have taught this is discontentedness. I have taught this is the cause of discontentedness. I have taught this is the elimination of discontentedness. I have taught this is the way leading to the elimination of discontentedness. And why, monks, have I taught this? Because this is beneficially relevant to the fundamentals of the holy life and leads to fading away of strong feelings, to freedom from strong feelings, elimination, to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Therefore, I have taught this. Thank you.
Okay, this is a perfect chapter from what we were just talking about, right? That a Buddha is only going to teach the things that actually lead to enlightenment. That's the only relevant things to actually be discussing, right? And of course, it's interesting to talk about these other topics, and we should continue to decide to talk about those. But ultimately, it all comes back to what are the collection of teachings that are needed to be able to get to enlightenment. So here, there's this story of the Buddha walking through this forest, essentially, with his ordained practitioners. And he picks up some leaves in his hand and he asks them, what's more numerous, the leaves overhead and all the trees or those in his hand? And of course, those in his hand are insignificant compared to the ones that are overhead. The ones overhead are much more numerous. And the Buddha says, so too is essentially the wisdom that he acquired in his journey to enlightenment. It's represented by all the leaves and all of the trees. But the wisdom that he's going to teach in order to help you get to enlightenment is represented by these few leaves that are in his hand, right? So you guys have studied the teachings of the Buddha enough to realize how comprehensive and how significant they are. And you haven't even necessarily learned them all and mastered them all yet. So that's the few leaves. So if you can imagine all the leaves overhead and all the things that the Buddha understood, he didn't teach all those things because they didn't actually lead to enlightenment. They weren't beneficial. They were irrelevant. So a Buddha is going to have experiences far beyond just what he's been able to understand in order to get to enlightenment, but he's not going to teach all those things because it's not relevant to helping his students to be able to get to the path to enlightenment. So a Buddha really needs to narrow down what it is that he's going to share so that he can give the students exactly what they need to be able to get to enlightenment. And that collection of teachings by itself is quite comprehensive. You know, it can be learned, it can be approached. It's a challenge, but it's possible for you to continue to journey on that and be able to overcome the obstacles to be able to then experience enlightenment. But even that is a significant amount of information for a student to be able to learn. So what the Buddha actually taught, which he points to countless times in his teachings, is the Four Noble Truths. He will point to this as the very beginning of his teachings, that this is discontentedness, this is the cause of discontentedness, the elimination of it, and the way leading to the elimination of discontentedness. That's what he taught. He didn't teach about an afterlife or residing in heaven after this or going to hell or anything like that. He taught how to get rid of discontentedness. That's his teachings. And there's a certain collection of teachings that you need in order to learn that. And that's what he taught. So you can be sure that what he taught is what it takes to be able to get to enlightenment. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter. This is chapter 36. Okay, I don't see any questions. So we'll go to chapter 37. Is there someone who would like to read this one? I think Samantha had raised her hand. Yeah, there she is. Go ahead, ma'am.
One who points out treasure shall not do as treats the raw damp clay, repeatedly restraining you. I shall speak to you, Ananda, repeatedly guiding you of what to avoid. I shall speak to you, Ananda. The truly dedicated will stand the test. Regard him as one who points out treasure, the wise one who, seeing your faults, guides you of what to avoid. Stay with this sort of teacher. For the one who stays with a teacher of this sort, things get better, not worse.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So this is a good teaching that kind of connects with all the other teachings that we've been exploring during this class, where once again, what we were sharing earlier is where the Buddha was saying he's not here to restrain his students. He's here to teach them. And essentially, it's up to the student to cultivate the wisdom and then restrain themselves. And as part of that guidance, what a teacher does is they point out treasure, right? Like there's a diamond over there on the ground, and there's a ruby, and there's a sapphire, and there's an emerald. What a teacher is doing is saying, hey, you see this conceit over here? This is your conceit. Or, hey, see this speech over here that you're using? This is unwise. Or see the way that you're interacting with these individuals? This isn't going to be helpful for you. So a teacher is constantly pointing out treasure for their students. And what the Buddha is saying is stay with this sort of teacher because things get better, not worse. Because a teacher who's doing that, again, they're not doing it for their own benefit. They're doing that out of compassion for their students, the concern for the misfortune of others. A teacher who's teaching in the way that the Buddha taught, they don't want anything from you. They don't expect anything from you. Their only interest is to help you to be able to get to enlightenment. And they're going to need to be able to point out treasure for you. But the ego can have a lot of trouble with this. The ego can be really challenged with this because as a teacher is pointing out this treasure, the mind doesn't want to look at it because the mind is oftentimes complacent and that it doesn't want to really truly do the work that's needed. And it can be pretty daunting, particularly at the beginning of the path, to see how much work you really need to do in order to be able to get to enlightenment. But if you just put one step in front of the other, in front of the other, in front of the other, next thing you know, you're halfway up the mountain, right? So you're going to need to have a teacher, and this person's going to need to point out things for you. There's no way for you to be able to get to enlightenment without that, because the mind's pollutions of craving, anger, and ignorance, particularly this ignorance, is like looking out at the world through a dirty window, and you can't see everything. A teacher is able to see if they've either gotten to enlightenment or close to enlightenment. Will be able to see your pollutions of your mind. They'll be able to see it, and then they'll be able to point it out for you. And your mind won't see it at first, and it might not even be wanting to see it or interested to see it. So a teacher is going to need to point that out to you. And that's why you need a very patient teacher who's not getting mad at you, not getting frustrated, not getting angry, and someone who loves you unconditionally. That when you do have missteps, that they're not angry and frustrated and bitter and harsh with you, but instead they're interested in building you up and seeing you become a better and better person. And what the Buddha is saying is stay with this sort of teacher, because they don't have anything that they want from you. They're just there to help you. It's like you have this advisor in your corner who is only interested in seeing you get to enlightenment. They don't have any other motivation. They don't have a hidden agenda or any of that kind of stuff. They're just interested in seeing you get to enlightenment. But they're going to need to point out treasure for you. And you're going to need to be willing to bend down and pick up that treasure. Because oftentimes, as I shared, the unenlightened mind isn't interested to do that because it's complacent, it's got ego in there, and it's got that central desire that's just holding on to what it's currently doing. Even people who have sometimes been on the path for 2 or 3 years, they can sometimes turn away from the path because they see how challenging that it can be, and they're just not willing to confront those difficulties and challenges that they're experiencing. And for a teacher to point out that treasure for them, it can be really damaging to their ego, and the mind doesn't like that. So oftentimes those cravings and that ego will cause someone to push away a teacher. This is aversion, like you guys have heard me share before with craving, desire, attachment, that when the mind's having those painful feelings, it'll associate that with something external. It'll either push a person away or a situation away. It'll be bitter, harsh, and hostile to that person, or it'll put its expectations on people and try to control people. And the unenlightened mind is doing this before it ever comes to the path to enlightenment. But even when it's on the path to enlightenment, even after several years of practicing these teachings closely, the mind can still be doing this. Even as they've been learning for 2 or 3 years, the mind can still do this. So the Buddha is encouraging you to stay with the type of teacher who has no vested interest in anything other than helping you get to enlightenment, who's willing to point out this treasure for you and doesn't want or expect anything from you. And things are only going to get better, not worse. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter. Okay, I don't see any questions anywhere, so we'll go to the next one. This is chapter 38. Would someone like to read this one? Okay, looks like Vibhav. Kelly's going to give that one to you.
The introduction of Ajayaka. Then some of these beings thought, evil things have appeared among beings, such as taking what is not given, condemning, lying, punishment, and banishment. We ought to put aside evil and unwholesome things, and they did so. They put aside evil and unwholesome things in the meaning of Brahman, which is the first regular title to be introduced for such people. They made leaf huts in forest places and meditated in them. With the smoking fire gone out, with pestle cast aside, gathering alms food for the evening and morning meals, they went away to a village, town, or royal city to seek their food, and then they returned to the leaf huts to meditate. People saw this and noted how they meditated. They meditate is the meaning of Jayaka, which is the second regular title to be introduced. However, some of those things, not being able to meditate in leaf huts, settle around towns and villages and compile books. However, some of those beings, not being able to meditate in leaf huts, settle around towns and villages and compile books. People saw them doing this and not meditating. Now, these do not meditate is a meaning of Ajayaka, which is the third regular title to be introduced. At that time, it was regarded as a low designation, but now it is the higher. This then, Vaseta, is the origin of the class of Brahmins in accordance with the ancient titles that were introduced for them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vibhav. So the only thing here that's really of help is to be able to help you understand the origins of these different classes and categories within the culture and society that existed during the lifetime of the Buddha. There isn't anything here that's going to help you eliminate discontentedness, but it's just information for you to understand where these different terms come from. So let me know if you guys have any questions on this. Okay, I don't see any questions anywhere. So we'll go to this next one, chapter 39. Maybe Vibhav has a question. Go ahead, sir.
Just can you go back to the chapter, please?
Sure.
This, so basically, I guess this is saying that's this is title because people do not. Some people meditate and they're called the janikas, and there are other people who do not meditate, and then there are people who are just like, I guess, they're just compiling books.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what is the reasoning behind this discourses?
This is just information of how these titles came about, how these people were classified, and the Buddha is explaining how this came about.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. Is there someone who would like to read this chapter 39? Okay, Kili, go ahead, ma'am.
Reciting the teachings, the basis of liberation. Again, neither the teacher nor a fellow monk in the position of a teacher teaches the teachings to a monk, nor does he himself teach the teachings to others in detail, as he has heard them and learned them, but he recites the teachings in detail as he has heard them and learned them. In whatever way the monk recites the teachings in detail as he has heard them and learned them, in just that way, in relation to the teachings, he experiences inspiration in the meaning and inspiration in the teachings. As he does so, joy arises in him. When he is joyful, joy arises. For one with a joyless mind, the body becomes tranquil. When tranquil in body feels calm. For when feeling calm, the mind becomes concentrated. This is the third basis of liberation, by means of which, if a monk recites motivated, dedicated, and determined, his unliberated mind is liberated. His undestroyed taints are completely destroyed, and he reaches the as yet unreached, unsurpassed security from bondage, enlightenment. That's all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kili. So as you see here, this is taken from what's called the 5 bases of liberation. The Buddha gives 5 things that are needed in order to be able to get to enlightenment. And the first one is basically a teacher. He talks about how everybody's going to need a teacher in order to be able to get to enlightenment, because the Buddha knows that they got to enlightenment by themselves, but other people aren't going to be able to do that same thing. So as part of like kind of the 5 things that an individual needs in order to get to enlightenment, this is called the 5 bases of liberation. This is just one of them. This is the third one. And during the lifetime of the Buddha, this was important that you were able to recite the teachings. This is the chanting, that every 2 weeks his students would come together and they would recite his teachings orally. And if you didn't know how to do that and you weren't capable of doing that, you wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment because your mind hadn't retained the teachings. So people would remember his teachings word for word, where today we have them in books, videos, podcasts, audiobooks, things like this, and you can reference those sources and then you can commit it to memory. Not necessarily word for word, but you can commit the understanding to your memory. And you don't need to chant in order to be able to do that, because you can pop open a book and study it that way, and that's how it gets into your mind. But if you didn't have books and stuff available to you, and the only thing you had was this teacher who was teaching orally, which what the Buddha was doing, you would have to remember what he said, and the other people of the community would have to remember what he said, and then they would come together and they would recite it through chanting as a way to commit it to the mind. So you can see from the origins of chanting that it's not a rite or ritual or a ceremony, worship or prayer. It was just a learning tool. It was a learning device. And if you weren't able to chant during the lifetime of the Buddha, you wouldn't be able to get to enlightenment. where that's not the case nowadays. You could actually still get to enlightenment without chanting. That's why when you look at the Eightfold Path, there isn't a factor that says right chanting. It's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. That's the core central path. The Buddha was wise enough to understand that things are going to change over time. So that's why reciting the teachings wasn't part of the core path, but was more something that was being done at that time in order to be able to remember the teachings. So you can see this discourse if you like. There's places for you to look at it. I don't have the full discourse in our collection of teachings here because I teach it in all these other ways. But there's these 5 bases or 5 things that are needed in order to get to enlightenment. And even though this is one of them, it's no longer needed in order to be able to get to enlightenment. And that's why I put this one in here for you guys to be able to see it. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this discourse. Okay, I don't see any questions anywhere. So we'll go to the next chapter, which is the last one for today. This one is a bit different. We're going to now move into something called misunderstandings. And there's several misunderstandings here that this book series has collected up, and then it's gone out and done, people have done research to be able to figure out where these misunderstandings are coming from. So we can read this. It doesn't read like the words of the Buddha because it's not the words of the Buddha, but it's helping you to be able to understand where these misunderstandings came from. And this is the first one, the misunderstanding regarding benefits of creating Buddha images, because nowadays people think that there's some benefit in creating an image of the Buddha or a statue of the Buddha. So would somebody like to read this? Okay, looks like Leo. Go ahead, sir.
Misunderstanding regarding benefits of creating Buddhist images. The benefit of creating Buddhist images can be found in Patanguli Vaja Jataka, which shares the creation of the Buddha image from sandalwood by King Pasenadi of Kosala, that once upon a time the perfectly enlightened one journeyed from Savatthi to a distant place to share the teachings. At that time, King Pasenadi of Kosala, surrounded by a great number of people, went to the great monastery in Jetavana. Not seeing the perfectly enlightened one, the king was filled with disappointment and saying, "This world without the perfectly enlightened one is without a refuge and without a protector." Once he returned home, he thought of making an image of the Buddha. When the Buddha returned to Jetavana, having worshipped the master, king asked the Buddha if he will allow an image of himself to be made, and the Buddha gave permission to the king. When the Buddha image was completed, he invited the Buddha to see the image and asked what would be the benefit of creating a Buddha image. The Buddha then told the benefits that whoever creates a Buddha image, whether a man or a woman, whether made of clay or of rocks, made of metal or copper, made of wood or zinc, made of precious stone or silver or gold, they produce great merit. As long as there is a Buddha image, this world will not be empty. The Buddha image helps prologue the teachings and practices. Those who build Buddha image will encounter happiness and all their wishes will be granted. The Buddha, while still unawakened, not yet fully enlightened, repaired the broken finger of the Buddha image. The benefits he gained were achieving a heavenly rebirth, passing away from the heavenly realm, entered into powerful kingship. He was able to defeat an army merely by lifting and bending his finger. Then the Buddha narrated an incident from one of his previous lives as King Patanguli, who was able to defeat an army merely by lifting and bending his finger. Out of 50 tales in the Panasa Jataka, Patanguli Jataka is the 20th Jataka. However, period, the composer, and the place of the composition is still unclear. Some of the accepted evidence has now become uncertain because new contradicted evidence has been found. The accepted opinion is composed by H. Prince Damrong Rajanubab in the preface of the first publication of Panasayataka that the book of Panasayataka consists of 50 ancient tales told in Thailand. A monk from Chiang Mai compiled and composed the tales in Magadhi language in around 1457 to 1657 CE, which was the period when monks in this country studied from Sri Lanka and were fluent in Magadhi language. They published books in Magadhi language in their hometown by explaining and elaborating the teachings, like the monks in Sri Lanka. Prince Tamarong Rajanubab also spoke about this book that originally the book of Panasayataka comprised of 50 palm leaf manuscripts tied together. Today can only be seen in Siam, Luang Prabang, and Cambodia. Other than that, they cannot be found. It has been told that the book was once found in Burma. They called it Chiang Mai Panasa. However, one of the kings in Burma said that the book is counterfeited words of the Buddha and ordered for them to be burned. Thus, the Panasayataka can no longer be found in Burma. The tales in Panasayataka are well known in Thailand, for example, Samadagurza tale, Sudana Manohara tale, Sangtong Kali, Ratasena tale, and Kavi tale.
Okay, thank you, Leo. So here, this first part that Leo read, all of this text, this is the tale that's in this book that the royalty declared to be counterfeit and that it wasn't the original words of the Buddha. And we can see that for ourselves if we understand the teachings of the Buddha and we go through this, where there's this part where it says that if you create a Buddha image, that all your wishes will be granted. It's somewhere in here. I'm sure you guys probably picked up on it as well. That has nothing to do with the teachings of the Buddha. And for anybody who studied the teachings of the Buddha, you know that that has nothing to do with the teachings of the Buddha. And the Buddha would never teach anything like that. That, you know, if you create an image or do anything, that immediately your wishes are going to be granted. Here it is right here. Those who build a Buddha image will encounter happiness and all their wishes will be granted. Wow, that sounds quite amazing, right? That means like it's like a shortcut to getting to enlightenment, that you just go over here and create a Buddha image and well, wham, everything's solved, right? That's not what the Buddha taught. And we know that through what we've actually studied through the actual discourses of the Buddha. So we can tell that this is not truly what the Buddha taught. And people 500 years ago figured that out as well. And they basically burned all these books in that they're essentially inaccessible to this point. So this is where this misunderstanding of somehow by creating a Buddha image, it's going to produce something beneficial in your life. It comes from this tale from about 500 to 600 years ago. And this is tracking that down for you so that the way that you can use this information is you understand that you don't need to run out and buy a Buddha statue or get a Buddha statue in order to be able to get to enlightenment. Sometimes when people are first getting onto the path, they're looking for external things to be able to grab onto and say, okay, now I am a Buddhist, right? And one of the first things I might look to is purchasing a statue, where you don't need to do that. You don't need to go out and have a statue. You can have a statue in your house if you like. There's no harm in that, but just understand that that statue isn't going to get you to enlightenment. And if you're attached to that statue, and if that statue was broken, or if it was stolen, or if it was damaged in a fire, and your mind is upset and angry, you can see you're attached to that statue. And now by having it, it's allowing your mind to be attached to it. And now it's actually hindering you from getting to enlightenment. So if you're going to have this statue, it would be helpful to look at it as a piece of artwork, right? And maybe help you to arise appreciation and gratitude towards the Buddha, and maybe help arise dedication in your mind towards learning and growing on the path. but you shouldn't think that you have to have a statue in your home in order to be able to get to enlightenment. And all these other things that you see where people talk about the spirit of the Buddha being in these statues, people bathing statues, feeding statues, and things like this, treating the statue as if it's the actual Buddha himself. This isn't part of what the Buddha taught, and it actually leaves the mind in this delusion or this unknowing of true reality. So you would like to overcome that by being able to see, where does this misunderstanding comes from? That helps you to be able to then more easily see the truth, and then to be able to move beyond this, so that then you can actually focus on what it actually takes to be able to get to enlightenment. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter. Okay, it looks like Yusuf has a question. Go ahead, sir.
Teacher, what is that bandage on your face? Or let me say, my dear teacher.
This is, I had a small surgery, was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday, to remove a mole from the side of the head. So there's stitches in there. So they told me I need to leave this on for a week because they're dissolvable stitches. And I suspect if they got wet, then, they would dissolve. So they asked me to keep this on for a week.
It's hard for me to follow. So, are you fine?
Yeah, I'm fine. There was a mole that was kind of protruding on the side of my head. And typically when I got a haircut, it would get hit by the barber. It happened many times. But normally it didn't cause any issue. But now I cut my hair by myself. And I actually was cutting my hair last week. And I actually cut it halfway off by accident. And it started bleeding. So I decided to just go get it removed. And they're going to test it for cancer because my grandmother had skin cancer. So there's a potential that I might get skin cancer. But so it was wise to take it off. I don't hear you.
Okay, take good care.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let me see if we have anything else.
Okay, take good care.
All right, I don't see any other questions anywhere. So what I'm going to do then is just end class by thanking all of you guys for joining. Thank you for reading. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation in the class and choosing to learn and practice these teachings, because this is the very best thing for you, those close to you, and all of humanity. Next week, we're going to be in the next 10 chapters. So feel free to read those beforehand, because it's surely going to help you to read the words of the Buddha and what I share as well, to be able to help you grow in your journey to enlightenment. And then, of course, we have our Pali Canon and English study group each Saturday. But on Sundays, we have our group learning program, where this Sunday, I'm going to be in chapter 16 of this book, which is titled Dissolving the Ego. Ego Serves No Purpose. This is where I'm going to teach you what is the ego, the complications and difficulties you experience because of it. And then I'm going to teach you how to eliminate it. So this can be really helpful for you to be able to understand how to eliminate the ego out of the mind. And then next week, I'm going to be teaching the Harmony and Relationships course, Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's going to be at the temple. And then on Sundays, we're doing meditation in the main hall at 6:30 at Wat Tong Yu. So if you're in Chiang Mai and you'd like to come by for the meditation in the main hall, you're welcome to do that as well. So again, thank you all for joining, and perhaps we'll see you guys in one of these future classes. Be well and take care. Sawadee ka.
Thank you again for watching. Enjoy your meditation. Look forward to seeing you online and answering any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.